Mornings in the small coastal town of Harbor Light always start like a familiar song, the soft sound of coffee, the morning sunlight streaming through the glass windows, and the sweet smell of pancakes wafting through the shop. Everything is peaceful until the door opens. An elderly black man walked in, wearing a gray suit, carrying a cane, walking slowly but steadily. He chose a table near the window, where the sunlight fell on his gentle face and a slight smile. No one knew who he was, but after a few seconds, the whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The chatter faded. Curious, wary, even annoyed looks permeated the normally friendly atmosphere. A young waitress, blonde, smiling brightly, suddenly became distant. She avoided his gaze, then quietly ignored him. 1, 2, 10 minutes passed. He still sat there, patient as someone who was used to this silence. No one knew that the man was not just a customer, and the waitress would have to face a truth that would shock the whole restaurant. A story about prejudice, dignity, and silent justice, where the truth does not need to be shouted. Just standing still is enough to make people bow their heads. If you believe that respect and justice still have a place in this life, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me in today's story. Waitress refuses to serve elderly black man, and what happened next will leave you speechless. Mornings in the seaside town of Harbor Light often come early. The first rays of sunlight slant through large windows, reflecting off polished wooden tables. The smell of roasting coffee and melted butter mingles with the clink of glasses against china. Outside, seagulls swoop near the shore, let out a few hoarse calls, and fly away toward the harbor. Inside the Harbor Light Cafe, life went on as usual. The town's regulars sat in the same corner, where they had sat for years, telling the same stories, sipping the same coffee. They knew each other's names, whose dog had just given birth, whose boat had just sold, whose boat was moving out of town. Everything was repetitive, orderly, calm, as if nothing could disturb the morning. Behind the counter, Emily Ross, a young waitress with her blonde hair tied back, moved quickly. Her steps were small and decisive. She brought coffee to this person, greeted that person, always with a polite smile. Everyone at Harbor Light knew Emily. She was considered the friendliest face in town. By the window, light fell on an empty seat. Tiny dust particles floated in the sunlight, shimmering like a thin breath. No one sat there, at least until the door opened. The small bell rang. The sound was familiar, but this time it made a few people slightly raise their heads. A man walked in, Mr. Elijah Carter, tall, slightly stooped, wore an old but pressed gray suit. His hair was streaked with black, and his eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses were unusually calm. In his hand, he held an ebony staff with an intricately carved head, the kind only experienced men would choose to use. He paused for a few seconds, as if adjusting to the light. Then he smiled slightly, looking around the cafe, the polite smile of a man accustomed to manners. He chose a table by the window, sat down, and propped his cane against the chair. Every movement was slow and orderly, as if time for him passed differently than for the rest of the world. No one said anything, but the atmosphere in the bar began to change. The clinking of spoons and glasses slowed. A middle-aged man looked up, then looked back down immediately. At a table near the counter, 2 young women whispered softly, their voices low enough that no one else could hear. The music in the bar was still playing, but it seemed quieter. Something invisible had entered with him. something unnameable, but enough to draw all eyes in the same direction. Emily froze when she saw him. She had just set the coffee pot down on the counter, her hands gripping the handle so tightly her face turned white, her lips pressed together, her smile gone. She looked at Mr. Elijah for exactly 1 second, then looked away. No greeting, no smile, just a casual nod, the kind one gives to a stranger or someone they don't want to deal with. Elijah didn't respond. He just opened the menu, turning the pages slowly with his fingers, stopping at black coffee, then nodding slightly to himself. He might have decided what to order, but no one came to ask. I think, if it were me, I would have stood up and left. But he didn't. He just sat there, his eyes calm as if time had no meaning. He must have sat in many cafes like this and waited in many similar silences. Outside, the sun was rising. Inside, smiles were still spreading across the faces of others, but not at him. A young man at the counter looked at him, opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. An older woman frowned and whispered to her husband, "Has anyone served him?" The man just shook his head. Emily must be busy. Busy. The word rang in the air, light but harsh. Emily passed Mr. Elijah's table twice. Each time, she kept her head down, as if avoiding a false gaze. He smiled, touching the tablecloth with his fingers, straightening a crooked corner, a small, delicate gesture, enough to show that he belonged to another world, one where politeness prevailed even when forgotten. No one noticed the small watch on his wrist. It was old, but the hands moved steadily. Each second passed like a heavy breath. I once heard someone say, "People's silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is the world's way of punishing someone just because they are different." I don't know if Elijah thought so, but, looking at him, I got the feeling that he understood it too well to be angry. At the bar, Emily was smiling with a group of regulars. She talked about the weekend party, the new cakes on the menu, her voice cheerful and casual. Only when her eyes glanced at Elijah's table did the smile disappear as if it had never existed. Harbor Light Cafe, where everyone knew each other by name, suddenly became a place where he was completely invisible. A young couple in the corner of the room looked at him, hesitant. The girl bit her lip and said softly, "Do you think anyone should do something?" The boyfriend just shook his head slightly. "It's none of our business, honey." She bowed her head, and so everything continued as if nothing had happened. Only the sunlight changed. It moved slowly across the wooden floor, stopping right where he sat, illuminating the thin hand resting on the end of his cane. Outside, the waves crashed against the wooden dock, the sound echoing like the heartbeat of the town. Inside, the eyes continued to avoid. A long time passed without anyone saying anything. Elijah looked up, his gaze sweeping silently around the cafe. He took a deep, slow breath, as if trying to memorize the smell of the coffee or maybe testing his patience. No one came. He just smiled slightly, adjusted his vest collar, and continued sitting still. In his world, dignity was not about how others treated you, but how you held yourself in the midst of them. And so the morning at the Harbor Light Cafe continued, as if nothing had happened. There was just one difference: the tranquility of the cafe now had a crack. Small, but irreparable. Mr. Elijah Carter entered as if on a different rhythm from the rest of the world. The door closed softly behind him, and the small bell still jingled in the air as his footsteps touched the light wooden floor. The morning light slanted through the glass window. sliding across the shoulders of his gray suit. The suit was old, but neatly pressed, not the luxury of money, but the self-respect of a man of experience. The cane in his hand was not just a support, but a part of him, straight, steady, and calm. The people sitting near the window looked up slightly, then quickly turned back. No greetings, no smiles, just a few fleeting glances, enough to establish distance. He paused in the doorway, took a deep breath. The smell of coffee, butter, and pastries hung in the air a pleasant scent. But today it was mixed with something else, a faint, but palpable, whiff of prejudice. Elijah didn't let it show. He just looked around, a slow, sweeping look, taking in every little detail of the room, the wooden board with the chalked menu, the small vase of flowers on the table, the ticking clock on the wall. Then he chose a seat, a table by the window. The sunlight shone in, illuminating the pure white cloth. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and carefully placed his cane beside him. To another person, this might have been a meticulous gesture of old age, but to him it was the courtesy of someone accustomed to order. I think there are people who, without opening their mouths, let you know they have walked long and difficult paths. He was that kind of person. Every nod, every breath exuded a calmness that only those who have endured can possess. He opened the menu and read slowly. His lips moved along the words. Perhaps he didn't really need to look. He already knew what he wanted. But reading the menu was a way for him to slow down, to get into the rhythm of the morning. At a nearby table, a middle-aged man folded his newspaper, deliberately not looking at it. A young girl put her spoon down on her plate and sighed softly. Everyone seemed to continue their work, but no one was truly at ease anymore. The waitress, Emily Ross, emerged from behind the counter, a shiny silver coffee pot in her hand. She smiled as she poured coffee for the group in the corner. When her eyes caught Elijah's, her smile faltered for a split second. She gave a slight nod, maybe a hello, but maybe not. Then she turned away. Elijah watched, his eyes not reproachful, just the look of someone who had witnessed this many times before. He put the menu down. His hands were folded on the table, shaking slightly, not because of his age, but because the weather at sea was colder than usual this morning. He sat still, watching the sunlight reflect off the table, smiling slightly. Maybe he was thinking of his wife, who had died 2 winters ago. They used to sit together in little cafes like this. She always ordered milk coffee, he always black coffee. Maybe that memory was somewhere in the coffee fumes. But as the memories faded, he just sat there, waiting. Time passed in the cafe as the coffee machine hummed. 1, 2, 3 tables were served. Emily smiled and talked with everyone, but his table remained silent. He didn't look at his watch or call anyone. He just sat and waited. I don't know what he was thinking, but if I could guess, I'd say he was saying to himself, "Don't let your dignity be sacrificed for a cup of coffee." He folded the paper, his eyes scanning the headline, "First Black Politician Nominated for Major Office." He paused, nodded, his gaze warming slightly. Maybe he felt something, a fragile belief that things were changing, but he did not know that. Just a few steps away. The truth was proven the opposite. At the counter, Emily was talking to the manager. Their voices were low. Only a few words could be heard. That old man. No rush. Wait a minute. Then she turned back, still smiling. But there was something in her smile that was hard to name, not malicious, just the habit of a world that believed it was permissible to delay someone because of the color of their skin. Elijah remained seated. He adjusted his cuffs and tapped his fingertips lightly on the table, a steady rhythm like the ticking of a clock. A little boy, walking with his mother, ran past his table and accidentally dropped a spoon. Elijah bent down, picked it up, wiped it clean, and returned it to the boy. The boy smiled shyly and said, "Thank you." Elijah replied, "It's okay, son. Never apologize for a little thing." The mother looked at the scene, confused. She said thank you softly, then pulled her child away quickly. The incident was small, but it caused a few other people in the cafe to turn and look. A man at a distant table said to his friend, "He seems nice." The other replied, half jokingly, "Yeah, but nice doesn't buy you coffee." A soft laugh escaped, thin as steam, not loud, but enough to make someone feel sad. Elijah didn't hear, or perhaps he heard and chose to remain silent. He kept his smile vague, his eyes fixed on the window where the seabirds were flying in formation. It occurred to me that perhaps he had been a professor, or a doctor, or someone who had taught others about human dignity. No one could maintain such a calm posture without having learned to endure long silences. The sunlight slid slowly from his shoulders, leaving a small shadow on the tabletop. He watched it, as if watching himself fade into the room filled with voices. Time passed. Emily was still busy with other tables. Once, twice, 3 times she passed by, each time avoiding that look, a look that was gentle, but made one dare not meet it. Finally, he let out a small breath, not a sigh, but the sigh of someone who understood that things were going to be the same again. Then he took the tissue, folded it neatly, and placed it beside him. The gesture was as light as the wind, but in that lightness there was a lifetime of composure. Behind, laughter still echoed, dishes still clanged. Harbor Light Cafe, the cafe of coastal friendliness, continued to operate as if no one had been left behind. But in that bright corner there was a man still sitting, completely in silence. And sometimes it was that silence that made people turn to look. As Elijah Carter sat down, the rhythm of the Harbor Light Cafe seemed to change. No one gestured, no one spoke. But in that moment the sounds of the morning became different. The laughter in the corner of the room died down. The sound of spoons clinking glasses was no longer steady. Even the sound of the coffee maker, which had been whirring in its usual rhythm, seemed to pause for a moment before continuing. A thin silence fell. Not a peaceful silence, but a weighty silence, like an invisible pane of glass placed between him and the rest of the room. Elijah said nothing. He unfolded the tissue, set it gently on his lap, and looked out the window. The light reflected off the glass, casting a picture of him and the bar behind him, faces talking, but eyes occasionally turning to him. A group of customers at the middle table shifted slightly, as if to get a different view. They didn't look directly at him, only glanced through the mirror behind the counter. A middle-aged white man raised his eyebrows and whispered to his wife. "Who is he?" The wife replied softly, without looking up. "Must be a stranger. It's rare to see someone like that around here." "Someone like that," the man repeated, his voice absent-minded, but the words left a heavy echo. No one in the bar named what they were thinking, but it was there in the air, in the way voices were caught mid-sentence, in the quick glances everyone pretended not to see. At the table near the door, Emily Ross stood with a tray of pastries in her hands. She glanced at Mr. Elijah, then turned to the customer next to her, smiling wryly. When the customer asked her a question, she answered more quickly than usual, her voice a half-tone higher, as if to cover up her inexplicable awkwardness. Elijah sat there, straight, his hands clasped on the table. He gave no sign that he noticed the unusual atmosphere, but perhaps he was too used to it to notice. I remember hearing an older man say, "Silence doesn't kill you outright, but it slowly erodes your trust in the world." Looking at Elijah now, I understand that more than ever. A little boy sat at a table by the window, staring at him. He asked his mother, "Mommy, why isn't there anyone waiting on him?" The mother put her hand on his shoulder and shook her head slightly. "Shh, eat." Then she turned away, pretending to be busy with her phone. That innocent question fell into the air, quietly fading away, like a small pebble thrown into a lake, creating a few ripples and then disappearing. Outside, the sunlight was still shining, but inside the bar, its brightness seemed held back by something invisible. Everything suddenly felt more oppressive, as if the room were trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, while everyone knew it was no longer normal. A young man in a police uniform sat at the counter. He looked at Elijah, frowning slightly. Then he shrugged and continued drinking his coffee. The shrug was slight, but it seemed to end any possibility of intervention. Elijah reached up and adjusted his glasses. The gesture was small and slow, but as he did it, all eyes seemed to follow him for a moment. He didn't look back, didn't say anything. He just picked up the paper, unfolded it, and read as if everything around him was okay. At the next table, a middle-aged woman stared at him for a long moment. Her eyes were filled with something mixed: pity, curiosity, and shame. Finally, she bent down and stirred her coffee until it swished. There was something about the way Elijah sat that made it impossible to turn away completely. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt, just calm, and it was that calm that made those around him so confused. I wonder if he got angry. Would people feel better? Because when a person reacts, they give us a reason to justify. But when they just stay silent, we are forced to look at ourselves. Elijah folded the newspaper and set it aside. His eyes fell on the empty coffee cup on the table beside him, the table of departing customers. Perhaps he expected to be served soon. But minutes passed, and no one came. Emily was still at the counter, chatting and laughing with the manager. A bead of sweat rolled down her forehead, not from the heat, but from the feeling of being seen. No one said anything, but in the eyes of a few customers, she sensed the question, "Why aren't you serving him?" She turned away, avoiding his gaze, picked up the tray of cakes and walked quickly in the other direction, the direction where Mr. Elijah was not. Elijah tilted his head, his eyes following her, then paused. A small smile. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't need to understand. A small fly flew around his table and landed on the edge of his glass. He waved his hand to brush it away, as lightly as a breeze. The gesture made a nearby customer turn around and see his smile, gentle and polite. The customer shyly turned away, not knowing why he felt so embarrassed. The air was still thick. Normalcy now felt like a burden. An older woman, Mrs. Margaret Hill, who owned the flower shop on the corner, sat silently, watching the scene through her reading glasses. She put down her teacup and tilted her head slightly. At her age, she had seen enough to know what was going on, but, like everyone else, she remained silent. I shouldn't interfere, she told herself. Maybe the waitress had her reasons. But when she looked at Elijah again, she realized that any reason seemed small. He sat still. Not a word. Not a single unnecessary movement. His silence made one realize that there were battles that did not require weapons. Only someone calm enough not to walk away. Another 10 minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked. Emily turned her back to him, pretending to wipe the table. She glanced through the glass and saw him still sitting there, back straight, his gaze distant. She felt a twinge of guilt, but she brushed it off, like everyone else who had been taught to keep out of trouble. The atmosphere in the cafe had changed completely. It was no longer the friendly morning of a small town, but a mirror someone was being challenged, and everyone else was watching to see who would speak first. But no one did anything. The silence remained, thicker, heavier, as if clinging to the lot. Elijah let out a soft breath, closing his eyes for a moment. Maybe he was resting, or maybe he was waiting to see how long it would take for the world to stop pretending not to see him. And in that moment, Harbor Light Cafe, once considered the warm heart of the town, accidentally exposed the coldest truth. Sometimes injustice doesn't need to be shouted, it just needs to be silent long enough. Emily Ross moved between tables with the speed of someone who knew every tile in the cafe. She was in her early 20s, her blonde hair tied back neatly, her beige uniform hugging her youthful figure. She smiled often, the kind of smile that made many regulars' mornings less stressful. She was the kind of person everyone in town knew. She greeted each customer by name, remembered how they liked their coffee, knew who liked waffles and who only drank mint tea. She was quick-witted, cheerful, and always knew how to make someone laugh. At Harbor Light Cafe, Emily is pretty much the life of the morning. But this morning, when she turned around and saw Elijah Carter, everything stopped. For just a split second, her gaze stopped mid-air. The smile was still on her lips, but the light in her eyes was gone. It was as if someone had drawn the blinds, dimming the room. Mr. Elijah sat by the window, stoic, slightly hunched, his hand resting lightly on his cane. The light cast a soft glow on his gray hair and glasses. He was reading the menu, his movements gentle, as if everything were in its place. Emily looked at him, and there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, brief but clear. Then she lowered her head, adjusted the cake tray in her hand, pretending to be busy. No one noticed. But I did. And I wondered, why did just an old man sitting in the cafe make her change her attitude so quickly? Maybe it was the difference. Maybe it was something she'd heard a warning, an unconscious habit, a small fear she couldn't quite name. She passed Elijah's table, carrying a light scent of perfume. He looked up, his eyes warm, enough to say hello. She just nodded, then turned away a polite, cold nod, leaving no trace of the hospitality she usually reserved for others. At the next table, a regular named Tommy called out, "Emily, can I have some more sugar?" She turned back, smiling quickly as if nothing had happened. "Right here, Tommy." She walked up to the table, her rubber shoes clicking lightly on the wooden floor. She smiled, asked Tommy's wife, and told a few anecdotes, her voice clear, easy to listen to. The table laughed. She was Emily again, cheerful, friendly, energetic. Only when she returned to the counter did she drop the tray, a little more forcefully than usual. Elijah remained seated in the same spot, reading the newspaper. Everything about him seemed so quiet, so unsettlingly orderly. Emily looked at him one more time, then turned away. The manager, Mark Duffy, about 40, stocky, stepped out from behind. "What's wrong, Emily? You look a little strange," he asked quickly. "Nothing," she replied in a low voice. "It's just a little crowded this morning." Mark didn't ask any more questions. He glanced at Elijah's desk for a moment, then turned back around, not thinking much of it. But for Emily, that moment was enough to make her feel secure. She thought to herself, "It's not just me. Maybe he doesn't fit in here. Maybe he's out of place." She continued on, carrying the coffee to the table near the door. As she passed Elijah, she lowered her head, avoiding his gaze. From that angle, you could see her hands gripping the tray a little too tightly, like someone trying to keep her composure. Maybe she didn't mean to be dismissive, but her coldness was familiar, a social reflex she'd seen all her life without ever questioning. An old woman called to her, "Emily, honey, please add some honey." "Yes, I'll be right there." Her voice softened, friendly, sweet, just with other people. Elijah folded the newspaper and set it gently on the table. He looked around. No one was approaching. There was a hint of weariness in his eyes, but no resentment. He simply picked up the napkin and adjusted the glass of water in front of him, as if everything were aligned, the world would stop tilting. The scene was so quiet that if anyone looked closely, they would see that the stillness was a reflection of the waves rising in other people's hearts. Emily came out again, bringing cake to two people sitting in the corner. She smiled, set down her plates, and whispered something that made them both laugh. Then she turned away and her eyes accidentally swept across Elijah's table. This time, he looked straight at her, not too long, not harshly, just enough to show that he realized he was being ignored. In that moment, their eyes met. Emily looked down quickly, almost fearfully. I don't think Elijah looked at her with anger. No, it was the look of someone who knew too much about people to feel anger. That look, I know, makes many people feel small. Emily walked into the kitchen, leaned against the wall, and took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding harder than usual. She didn't know why. It was just that man made her feel uneasy. Perhaps it was because his eyes were so calm, or perhaps it was because in that calmness she saw reflected something she did not want to see, a question she had never asked. If I were in his position, how would I endure it? She shook her head and reassured herself. Don't think about anything else. Get to work. And so she continued serving the other tables, smiling, greeting, pouring coffee, clearing plates. Every movement was precise, as if she had erased the image of the man by the window from her mind. But every time she passed the mirror, she still saw his shadow there, calm, motionless, like an anchor of truth in a room full of pretense. Elijah remained seated. Emily remained evasive. And the Harbor Light Cafe continued to operate a perfect act that no one dared to break. Outside, the sun rose higher. Light poured in, dividing the room into two parts. Light, dark. Elijah sat in the middle. Emily walked in the light, but her shadow stretched across him. If that scene were in a movie, the cameraman would probably just keep it in frame for 30 seconds. No background music, no dialogue. Just let the audience feel the suffocation of silence. And I believe anyone who watches that scene will wonder, Why is it so hard to do the right thing? Elijah Carter sat quietly at the table by the window. The morning light had softened, becoming warmer, reflecting off his glasses. Outside, the wind carried a familiar scent of sea salt. Inside, the voices were still steady, just quieter, as if someone invisible was signaling everyone to lower their voices. Elijah picked up the menu and studied it. He tilted his head to get a better look, then nodded. The menu was small, a few pastries, coffee, orange juice. He stopped at the pancakes, the kind his wife had liked. Maybe he just wanted to order one of those, to keep up with old habits. He raised his head, looked around, searched for the waitress's eyes. Emily Ross was standing at the far end, talking to two customers near the counter. She smiled, nodded, and turned away. Elijah raised his hand, slowly, gently. His hand shook slightly, not from anger, just from age. She didn't see, or maybe she did, but chose not to notice. I think there are ways of refusing that are colder than words. They only require silence, prolonged and deliberate. Elijah held his hand up for a few seconds, then lowered it. No one noticed. He looked around. Other tables were filled with waiters, steaming cups of coffee, hushed conversation. He was the only one not asked. But his expression did not change. He just adjusted his sleeves, put down the menu, and waited. Time began to pass more slowly. 1 minute, then 5, then 10. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside. The light shifted off his shoulder, casting a pale shadow on the table. Emily walked past, carrying a tray full of cookies, which she carefully set down on a nearby table. As she turned, her eyes met his. For a brief moment. She ducked her head, avoiding his gaze, and walked quickly. She could have said, "I'll be right there," or "Please wait a moment." But she said nothing. Elijah watched her walk away, then smiled slightly. It was a small smile, but there was something in it that felt like resignation tempered into calm. He reached out and touched the cane beside him, as if it were an old companion. The ebony head, intricately carved, reflected the light. He had told his wife that this cane listened, because whenever he was silent, it was there, faithful, listening on behalf of the world. At a table near the counter, Mrs. Margaret Hill, an elderly woman who often sat alone with a cup of tea, watched the scene with a puzzled look. She knew something was wrong. She had taught all her life, had told her students that respect was the first lesson in character. But now, she just bowed her head. Perhaps because she understood that, in this room, silence was safer than reason. And if I were there, I probably would have kept quiet, too. And that scared me. Elijah took out the newspaper and opened it to the closed page. He read as if he were really interested in the article, but his eyes occasionally strayed from the text, stopping at the mirrored door behind him where Emily's silhouette appeared, then disappeared. Another 10 minutes passed. No change. A young man sitting near the door whispered to his girlfriend. "Didn't the waitress see him?" The girl replied in a small voice. "Yes, she did, but he probably hasn't ordered yet." He shook his head. He raised his hand. Twice. The girl paused, then lowered her voice. "Come on. Don't get involved. I don't know anything." That is how common sense disappears. Not in quarrels, but in advice to keep quiet. Elijah put the paper back on the table. He straightened the edges and sat still. His hand touched the glass, caressing the rim. A cold drop stuck to his fingertips. He watched the drop fall to the table, making a circle, spreading. He watched it like time, passing unnoticed. At the counter, Emily was pouring coffee for another customer. Her smile was friendly, her voice clear. "Would you like some cream, Mr. Harris?" "Oh, you really know me best." The man laughed loudly. Their voices blended together, creating a warm atmosphere. But to Elijah, the sound was only a backdrop to the growing emptiness. He raised his hand again, this time more slowly and clearly. Emily saw it. I know she saw it because her eyes lingered for a moment, then darted away. She pretended to wipe the table beside her, then turned away, leaving him alone with the light in front of the window. He lowered his hand, slowly. His breathing became a little heavier, not because he was tired, but because the air in the tavern had become heavier. At the opposite table, a young man in a workman's uniform bowed his head, avoiding eye contact. But his shoulders moved slightly, as if he were holding back something. Then he turned to his friend. "He's just an old man." His voice was shaky, lacking confidence. His friend remained silent. Elijah leaned back in his chair. He wasn't reading the paper or looking around. He was staring straight out at the vast, free blue sky, the complete opposite of this room. There was something very human about that image. A man being ignored but still holding his posture straight, as if his dignity was the last thing he would let anyone take away. And then another 15 minutes passed. No one came. Emily walked past his desk one last time, empty tray in hand. She didn't glance at him, but as she passed, her shoes brushed the leg of his chair. She paused for a split second, as if to say something, then stopped. She kept walking. Elijah didn't speak. There was no sorry. No, it's okay. Just silence, the kind that made the air hold its breath. I think that is the moment when justice begins to take shape, not in shouting, but in silence. When a person is offended, but does not react, they turn their silence into a mirror, for others to see themselves. Elijah remained seated. On the table, a half-empty glass of water stood out like a faint trace of light. Outside, the wind blew harder, making the windows rattle slightly. In that slight tremor, perhaps, was the voice of truth, something no one wanted to hear. The coffee at Harbor Light Cafe still smells familiar, but something has changed, something you can't see, only feel. Elijah Carter sat there, still patient. The newspaper was folded on the table, the glass half empty. The light from the window shone on his gray suit, highlighting the wrinkles in his clasped hands. 40 minutes passed. No one came to ask what he wanted. At the corner table, Mrs. Margaret Hill frowned slightly. Her eyes lingered on Elijah, then on the young waitress, who was laughing and talking with another customer. A thought crossed her mind. She might just be busy. But what kind of busyness would last 40 minutes with a single customer? She reached for the teacup, but it was cold. When she realized it, she understood not only was the tea cold, but the whole room was getting cold too. At a nearby table, a young couple was making small talk. The girl put down her cappuccino, tilted her head, and asked her boyfriend, "Did you see?" The waitress ignoring him, he glanced over and replied softly, "Maybe he hasn't ordered yet." I saw him raise his hand twice. He fell silent, bent down to stir his coffee, avoiding her gaze. "Come on, stop looking. It's none of our business." That sentence was like a small bolt closing the door of conscience. Across the street, Mark Duffy, the manager, stood at the counter, his head bowed as he took orders. He heard a few murmurs, but he didn't look up. He hated conflict. Every little thing will pass. He often said, but this morning, he was wrong. Little things, left too long, can become big cracks. I once heard someone say, injustice doesn't need evil people. It just needs enough silent people. And that day, I heard that saying come alive in this room. Elijah still showed no sign of discomfort. He turned the napkin over, wiped the rim of his glass, and smiled faintly, as if to reassure himself. The gesture sent a pang in Mrs. Hill's chest, a strange feeling, both pity and shame. Next to her, a middle-aged man, Mr. Howard Jenkins, the owner of a nearby mechanic shop, spoke in a low voice. That girl really didn't serve him, Margaret replied, shaking her head slightly. I've been sitting here since the beginning. She's been avoiding him all this time. Howard frowned. He's just an old man. Is that necessary? Margaret looked over and whispered, It's not because he's old. Howard didn't reply, but his eyes darkened. Both of them fell silent. No one knew what to say next. Emily Ross continued her rounds, serving other tables, her laughter still ringing, but out of place. It was like a coat of clear paint over a crack. The more you try to brighten it, the more it draws attention. A younger customer, Linda Price, sat alone at a table by the door. She was secretly filming with her phone. Her face was tense. She wasn't sure what to do, post it online, or keep it. She knew stories like this would spread quickly, but she also knew that in this small town, anyone who did anything different was talked about. She looked at Elijah, then at Emily. Her eyes wavered between right and safe. She put the phone down. No dial-in. I think, perhaps, that's a moment most people have in their lives when they know what's right, but are afraid to be the first to do it. Elijah sat quietly, his face impassive. A light breeze blew in from the door, ruffling a few strands of silver hair from his forehead. He blinked slowly, staring into the distance. No one knew what he was thinking, but I guessed he had been here, not this bar, but in this kind of situation too many times to be surprised. Mrs. Hill looked around. No one seemed about to speak. Even those who had appeared upset earlier returned to their breakfast as if nothing had happened. In the corner of the room, a little boy about 10 years old looked at Elijah, then asked his mother softly, Mom, why didn't the waitress bring the food to that man? His mother put her hand on his shoulder and said softly, Don't ask, eat. But Mom, he's been waiting for a long time. Shh. His mother's voice stiffened, and the boy looked down, silent. The story ends there, at least on the surface. But I know, in the boy's mind, it will remain a small seed of wonder that adults sometimes choose the wrong way to teach children about the world. Elijah gently lifted the napkin and folded it into a square. His hand shook slightly, but his movements were careful. He placed it in the middle of the table neat, like him, behind her. Emily was laughing, her voice ringing out clearly, David, would you like some strawberry ice cream on the waffle? The customer replied, Thank you. Emily, you are the cutest person here. She chuckled, You flatter me. Meanwhile, just a few feet away from them, Elijah sat there, a still figure in a lively scene, as if the world had chosen to forget him. Mrs. Hill looked at Howard and whispered, Should we say something? Howard shrugged. What should we say? She's an employee, and her boss isn't around. But what if he's someone's father, or someone important? Howard chuckled. Who's important here? Margaret. That saying, though unintentional, seems to summarize this whole small society where people are used to looking down on others, just because they don't seem important. The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to thicken. Conversations died down. People ate faster, bowed their heads more deeply, avoided looking around. The silence was unnatural, it was heavy, because everyone knew there was something wrong with it. And in that silence, Elijah sat still, silent, like a mirror revealing everything people wanted to hide. If justice had a shape, perhaps today it looked like him, weary, patient, but unyielding. I couldn't hear him breathing, but I knew he was breathing deeply, to keep himself calm, because he understood if he reacted, they would see a black man angry, but if he remained silent, they would have to see themselves. It is the choice of the wise to let justice speak by its silence. Time passes slower than any clock can count. Mr. Elijah Carter remained seated at his table by the window. He was straight and trim, but the light on his shoulders had changed. The bright morning was fading to a soft yellow, the light of the quiet afternoon hours. He lifted his glasses and adjusted them gently. It was a small gesture, a familiar ritual, as if everything in his world was still going on as normal. Outside, the sea breeze blew through the trees, the leaves swaying lazily. Inside, the clinking of spoons and glasses, the sounds of laughter still echoed, but to him, the sounds had changed. They were no longer alive, but like the distant echoes of another world, one he was not invited into. People still talk, still laugh, still sip coffee. It's just that, between those sounds, there is a gap. That gap is named after him. Miss Emily Ross passed again. She walked quickly, deliberately avoiding the table by the window. The light reflected off her golden hair, making her look almost radiant if it weren't for the shadow of avoidance that followed her. Elijah glanced at her, not blaming, not angry. He just observed, his eyes gentle but deep, as if he were watching a child do something it didn't understand why. The young waitress must have felt it too. At the counter, as she bent down to get her glass, her hand shook slightly. She knew he was still there. She knew he saw her, but she didn't have the courage to turn around. The silence was no longer theirs alone. It spread like a thin layer of mist covering the entire bar. In the corner, Margaret Hill cleared her throat as if to say something, then stopped. She had seen nearly an hour pass. Her tea had gone cold. On the table, a drop of condensation reflected Elijah's small, but hauntingly clear. She touched the handle of the cup lightly with her fingers, but did not drink. She felt a strange unease in her heart, as if she were being tested along with the man. I could have said just one word, she thought, but I dare not. I understand you, because I was once like that, witnessing something wrong and choosing to stay silent, just because I was afraid of what others would think. Silence, sometimes, is the instinctive reaction of those who have been hurt, but it is also the soil where injustice grows. At the next table, Howard Jenkins put down the newspaper and whispered to his wife. "That waitress hasn't brought him anything yet," his wife replied, her eyes still glued to her phone. "Maybe he's just resting. Don't make a big deal out of it. He's been waiting for almost an hour. Haven't you noticed, Howard? You don't know the circumstances. The saying is like a thin veil covering the truth, enough to avoid facing it, but not enough to make it disappear. Meanwhile, Elijah sat a little sideways, looking out the window. The light reflected off his glasses made it hard to see his eyes. Only his face was old and calm, as if carved from patience. A gentle breeze rustled the newspaper on the table. He put his hand up to hold it, a natural gesture. But in that small gesture, we could see the heartbreaking loneliness. At the counter, the coffee machine hummed, steam gurgled, and the room smelled of coffee. People continued to talk, but it seemed to be getting quieter. They didn't look at him, but the awareness of his presence permeated their every movement. Another young woman, Linda Price, who had intended to take a video, gently opened her phone again. She snapped a quick photo, then deleted it. Her finger lingered on the screen, hesitating. She heard two voices in her heart, one saying, "Do it," and the other saying, "Don't cause trouble." Finally, she turned off the screen. Perhaps people are not afraid of being wrong. They are just afraid of being seen as the only ones who dare to say the right thing. Elijah pulled an old watch from his pocket. He opened it and looked at the time. The second hand was still ticking. Nothing had changed, but his gaze lingered a little longer, as if he were counting not time but his own patience. He nodded slightly, then put his watch back on. A small, calm movement. He did not leave. I think if it were anyone else, they would have left long ago, but he chose to stay, because sometimes staying is the strongest form of resistance. Mrs. Hill could bear it no longer. She stood up, about to go forward, but then the eyes of several other guests stopped her. They looked at her not directly, just passing, as if to warn her. Don't disturb the peace. She sat back down, her hands shaking, across the street. Emily set her tray down on the counter and made a dull clatter. She sighed. "Are you okay?" Mark Duffy asked without looking up from his notebook. "Yeah, fine. It's a big crowd. Don't miss any orders." "Yeah." She turned away, something heavy in her stomach. She knew Elijah was still there, but the thought of going to that table scared her. She wasn't sure what fear of other people's eyes, or fear of his own. Perhaps what people fear most is not being judged, but being shown the worst part of themselves. Elijah straightened his collar and looked around. An elderly couple at the opposite table quickly turned away. A young man looked down at his phone, even though the screen was black. Another waitress wandered off to the back of the kitchen. He said nothing. No need. His silence was enough to make people talk to their own conscience. Outside, sunlight streamed through the glass, reflecting on his face, highlighting his deep, dark but bright eyes. A small ray of light passed through, touching the silver ring on his hand. The silver flashed, faint but strong, as a reminder that dignity never fades even when buried. The atmosphere in the restaurant became strange. Laughter was still present, but intermittent. The sound of knives and forks hitting plates sounded like cold metal. Each customer began to feel embarrassed without knowing why. Mrs. Hill looked over, her eyes wet. If I had had the choice, I might have stood up. But I also know that sometimes justice doesn't need words, just one person strong enough not to walk away. Elijah Carter sat there, motionless as the world spun around him. His silence was not weakness, but a silent music, slow, heavy, and so real that it silenced even the loudest. The room seemed to have cooled, even though sunlight still poured through the thick glass. The smell of butter and pancakes still lingered, but it wasn't as warm as before. It was just a smell, the smell of routine, of a new day, of people trying to believe that everything was normal. Emily Ross emerged from behind the kitchen counter, a tray of steaming pancakes in hand. Steam rose from the kitchen counter, reflecting the golden sunlight. Her smile was wide, the smile she'd practiced all year as a waitress, friendly, pleasant, just enough to get a tip. "Thank you." "Emily, it looks delicious." The middle-aged woman at the table near the window exclaimed. "Enjoy your meal," she replied, her voice as light as the wind. The whole table laughed. The sound was bright and clear, but when Emily turned around, her laughter died. Elijah Carter's desk was just a few steps away. He sat as before, upright, calm, the light reflecting on his kind face. On the table was a neatly folded newspaper, a half-empty glass of water, and a neatly folded tissue, as was the habit of someone used to living by order and principle. His eyes met hers, not probing, not reproachful, just a simple, quiet look, as if he were looking at a stranger he had met in another life. Emily bowed her head and walked quickly past. Not a word. Her rubber boots clicked lightly on the wooden floor, steady, but each step echoed in the silence. She set the tray down on the counter and took a deep breath. Her hands shook slightly, so briefly she didn't even know why. Behind the counter, Mark Duffy, the manager, glanced at his watch and asked, "And the old man in the corner, has he eaten yet?" Emily paused. "No, he hasn't ordered yet." "Hasn't ordered yet. I saw him raise his hand twice." She fell silent. Mark frowned. "Okay, I'll come over later." But he didn't go. He just said that to make it look like he was managing well. Then he went back to his inventory. In this world, people often get busy with unimportant things just to avoid facing what really matters. Elijah sat there, the center of a circle everyone tried to avoid. He didn't speak, didn't sigh, didn't look annoyed. He just adjusted his glasses occasionally, looked around, and then went back to his folded newspaper. There's something very American about that image, a man who has lived enough lives and been through enough wounds to know that knee-jerk reactions don't change anything. I think, perhaps you know better than anyone sometimes, what makes others feel most guilty is not the objection, but the cold composure of the offended person. Emily carried another tray and walked past his table again. Still, she didn't look. But in that moment, the light in the window reflected her image and she saw herself in it. She saw her face, beautiful, young, but her eyes were averted, small, afraid. She turned away quickly. At the table near the door, Margaret Hill kept watch. She had been a teacher for 30 years, teaching respect. Today, she sat there, watching a young girl forget it, and she didn't dare remind her. She touched the silver necklace, a gift from her late husband, as if to find courage. But, as she tried to stand up, she met the eyes of the other guests. No one said anything, but their eyes said, "Don't interfere. This is none of your business." She sat down, quietly. The atmosphere in the bar grew thick. The laughter seemed to come from somewhere else, distant and out of place. Everything was going on as usual, but that was the usual of places where injustice was familiar. Elijah took a deep breath. He picked up the napkin, wiped his wrist, and returned it to its original position. It was a small gesture, but it carried incredible patience. A boy sitting nearby. Tommy Jenkins, Mr. Howard's son, looked at Elijah and asked quietly, "Dad, why didn't the waitress bring the food to that man?" Howard glanced over and said quickly, "Eat, son, don't ask. But he's been waiting for a long time." Tommy, his voice hardened. The boy bowed his head, but his eyes remained on Elijah. There was something in that childlike gaze, something adults had lost the ability to recognize injustice before it was rationalized. Elijah sensed it. He turned slightly, smiling, a soft, gentle smile, the way he used to smile at his students in his old classroom. Tommy returned the small nod. Then he looked back at his food, but he would miss that smile. I knew it. Emily turned back to the counter, hearing the family's laughter behind her. Thank you, Emily. It was delicious. She smiled and said softly, I'm glad you liked it. But as she turned, her eyes flickered to Elijah's table where he was waiting. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then she looked away again. There is nothing more cruel than ignoring someone while they still smile at you. Mr. Elijah Carter watched her depart, then bent down. His hand rested lightly on the ebony cane, lightly touching the silver-carved head, an object that had belonged to his father, who had said, You don't need to shout to be heard. Just stand. He did just that. In this world, there are those who are born to speak, and there are those who are born to be silent, but their silence speaks for a generation. In the corner, a young customer quietly left, leaving a doubled tip. Mrs. Hill saw and understood not everyone has the courage to speak up, but sometimes silence comes in many forms. Elijah looked up. The sky outside was still blue, the sun was still shining, and he, still patient. The patience of one who knows that every great war begins with someone choosing not to stoop to the level of their offender. The clock on the wall in Harbor Light Cafe ticked past 11:30. Its steady ticking sound echoed a dry beat of time, cold and unfeeling, but also the only thing that was true in the room at the moment. 40 minutes, long enough for a breakfast to cool, a cup of coffee to melt, and a person to be erased from someone else's air. Mr. Elijah Carter sat there, still upright. His hand rested on the wooden staff, as if he were afraid of scratching it. On the table, the glass of water had become misty. A drop slid slowly down, making a sound so soft that it could only be heard when all other sounds had ceased. And at that moment, the restaurant was almost silent. Outside, the light was bright, the waves lapped in the distance. Inside, people ate, talked, and laughed, but it was as if there was a glass barrier between them. No one was really together. Mr. Elijah raised his hand, this time slowly and clearly. His hand, wrinkled, veined, reached out in the gesture of a man who still believed in courtesy, even though the world around him had forgotten it. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Miss Emily Ross passed by, white apron, tray of cookies still smelling fresh, still smiling as she greeted the other table. But when she got near him, she turned away, didn't look, didn't stop, didn't say a word. Her shoes clicked against the floor like a tap in silence definite, offbeat, and cold. I think there are small actions that speak louder than shouts. Ignorance is a language, and Emily made it very clear that day he didn't deserve to be seen. Elijah held his hand a few more seconds. No one came. No one asked. He lowered his hand, slowly. The movement was as light as a falling sheet of paper, but in the eyes of those watching, it was heavier than a thunderclap, because it was not just the hand that was being lowered, but the faith that was falling, bit by bit. His shoulders slumped for a moment, not because he was tired, but because he knew, though he didn't say it, that this wasn't the first time. Margaret Hill clenched her napkin tightly in her hand. The creases dug into her fingers. "Oh my God," she said softly, just enough for herself to hear. At another table, Howard Jenkins put down his newspaper. He didn't look at Elijah, but his eyes couldn't read the words anymore. His wife glanced over and whispered, "Howard, don't interfere. I beg you." "I didn't mean to interfere, but this is wrong. It's just wrong. You don't know the circumstances. What circumstances would it take to abandon someone like that?" His voice was low, but his words made several people look up, then down again, as if any look might drag them into something they did not want to see. Elijah adjusted his glasses. It was a small, familiar gesture. He looked around the bar, not looking for anyone in particular. Maybe he was just trying to make sure there were people in the world who could see each other. But in response, he was only bowed heads, averted eyes, and spoonfuls of coffee stirred slowly to pretend to be busy. Miss Emily Ross turned back to the counter, put down her tray, and took a deep breath. Mark, the manager, asked casually, "Is everything okay?" "Okay. What about the old man? He hasn't ordered anything yet." Mark looked at her, his eyes weary. "Okay, bring it when he orders. Don't let the customers complain." Emily smiled awkwardly. Yes, I don't know who she lied to more, the manager or herself. At the table near the door, Linda Price, the young woman holding the phone, turned on the camera again. The screen lit up, reflecting her face. Her hand shook slightly. She snapped a quick picture. Then she looked at the image of the old man in the light and the indifference around him. She looked at the photo for a moment, then turned it off. Didn't post it. "I don't want to be a bother," she whispered. The trouble she feared was the very thing that Elijah had lived with all his life. The air in the cafe was thick now. Even the light seemed heavy. The spoons, the glasses, the plates, everything seemed to move more slowly, more cautiously. And in the center of all this reticence, Elijah sat still, an anchor of dignity in a sea of indifference. A laugh arose from the other table, loud, crisp, but died away quickly, too piercing to be heard in the silence. I saw that, in that moment, everyone in the bar realized something was wrong, but it was like seeing someone about to fall. Everyone moved aside so as not to be pulled down. Elijah looked away. He looked outside. The sky was still blue, the wind still rustling the branches. A small bird landed on the windowsill and tilted its head to look inside. He smiled slightly. It was a fragile smile, but genuine. Mrs. Hill saw that smile, and tears welled up in her eyes, whether from pity or shame. She did not know. And Emily, she stood at the counter, seeing it all. That smile made it hard for her to breathe, because it wasn't the smile of someone weak, but of someone so strong that their silence made her tremble. She turned away, wiped the table, pretended to be busy, but every movement she made was awkward, out of sync. The last drop fell, not from the glass of water on Elijah's table, but from an invisible place, in the hearts of everyone present. And when the last straw broke, it didn't make a loud bang. It just created another silence deeper, heavier, like the pause before someone finally has to say something. Elijah sat there as if waiting for someone, not the waitress, not the food, but the awareness of the people around him. I don't know who in the bar exhaled first. It might have been Mrs. Hill. It might have been me, if I had been there. But I know that from that moment on, no one could say they didn't see. The door to Harbor Light Cafe opened. The bell on the door frame rang softly, but echoed through the heavy space like the first ray of light after the rain. Everyone turned to look. A woman walked in, Miss Sophia Carter. Tall, elegant, her navy blue suit fitted her high heels clicking firmly on the wooden floor. Around her neck was a white pearl necklace, gleaming in the sunlight. Not ostentatious, but enough to let people know she belonged to another world, where confidence did not need jewelry to prove it. She did not look around curiously like other newcomers. Her gaze was focused and determined. A single sweep of the room, then stopped. In the corner near the window where the sunlight slanted down, Mr. Elijah Carter sat alone. The newspaper before him was closed. His wooden stick lay parallel to the edge of the table, and his eyes were still gentle and calm, as if time had not shaken him. Her eyes suddenly lit up, softened for a split second. The coldness of the successful woman gave way to something very human: joy, relief, and affection. "Dad." Her voice rang out clearly, not loud, but firm. A simple sound, but it shook the whole cafe. All eyes immediately turned to Mr. Elijah's table: Emily, Mark, Mrs. Hill. All of them turned involuntarily toward the source of the voice. Mr. Elijah raised his head, the smile on his lips, the gentle smile that no one had deserved all morning, finally appeared. "My daughter." His voice was low, soft, but full of life. Sophia moved closer. Each step she took seemed to erase the distance between two worlds, between the forgotten and the one in control. I think there are moments where the gravity of the room changes, and this is one of them. No one said anything, but the atmosphere had changed. The atmosphere, once heavy with silence, was now as fragile and tense as a vibrating string. She stopped in front of her father's table. Father and daughter looked at each other. No words needed, no questions needed. "Why are you sitting here? Who serves you?" Only understanding, complete, between two eyes that had gone through years together where respect was not always given readily. Then Sophia bent down and hugged her father. It was an unobtrusive hug, slow, light, but deep as a breath. Her arm was around his shoulders, and his hand trembled slightly as it touched her back, as if he feared this was a dream. The whole restaurant was dead silent. No more sounds of knives and forks, no more laughter, no one moving. Emily Ross stood near the counter. The tray of cookies tilted slightly. The coffee cup on it shook, spilling over the rim. She didn't blink. She watched the scene, the two people embracing, and felt something inside her crack. Father and son. Why them Margaret Hill put her hand to her heart, feeling as if her heart had skipped a beat. Howard Jenkins, who had spent the morning clearing his throat and sighing, nodded slightly, the kind of nod that only people who have been wronged understand. Sophia let go of her father and adjusted his collar, a small but intimate gesture. Then she turned and looked around the shop. Her gaze was sharp and calm, the kind of gaze one gets from someone who's used to making decisions but doesn't need to shout. In an instant, everyone knew this woman was more than just a daughter. She was someone more. Emily bowed her head. She knew, somehow, that she was standing before someone she shouldn't disappoint, but she didn't know the real reason yet. Sophia looked at her for a moment. Nothing, just silence. But the silence carried a different weight, not shame, but power. "You came earlier than I thought," Elijah said softly, his voice soft. I had a meeting nearby. I wanted to have breakfast with you, but it seemed you had to wait a long time." The sentence was light, but echoed like a needle fallen on stone floor. Emily clutched the edge of her apron, not daring to raise her head. She wanted to explain, but her throat felt blocked. Sophia pulled out a chair and sat down next to her father. She skimmed the menu, her voice calm. "No one came to take your order." Elijah smiled. "They're probably busy. It's okay." But Sophia didn't smile. Her eyes grew cold. "Busy enough to ignore a customer for 40 minutes. Her voice was not high, but it was clear and distinct, like someone used to being in charge. But this time the anger in her was not about work, but about something more personal, deeper respect for the father she respected. I think it was in that moment that Emily understood that she had just touched something that was not allowed to be touched. Dignity. Mark, the manager, came out from behind the counter, smiling awkwardly. "Hello, I am Mark, the manager here." "Is there a problem?" Sophia turned around, her voice calm. "Nothing serious. It's just that my father has been sitting here for almost an hour and no one has served him. I want to know why." Mark glanced at Emily. Emily lowered her head. No one spoke. The air thickened. I don't know who saw the truth most clearly at that moment, but I'm sure that when Sophia said the two words, "my father," everything in that small room changed forever. Because from that moment on, the line between the despised person and the person with the right to choose has changed. Elijah Carter, the man forgotten all morning, was no longer just a silent customer. He was the father of a woman the rest of the restaurant had yet to recognize but was about to look up to. And like a song written in the eyes, the witnesses began to understand that justice, sometimes, does not need to come in anger. It comes in the walk of a woman in a blue suit, in the ringing of a doorbell at noon, and in a hug that makes the whole room bow. No one knows who held their breath first. All we know is that in that moment, the Harbor Light Cafe seemed to stop functioning. The clock stopped ticking, spoons stopped in midair, and half-finished conversations were swallowed. In the middle of that room, two people, Elijah Carter and Sophia Carter, hugged each other. A simple hug, no rush, no drama, no apologies, but so warm that everyone around felt their chests soften. Sophia put her hand on her father's back, and Elijah put his on her son's shoulder, hands that spanned 2 generations, 2 eras, one that held chalk in a small classroom where black children were not allowed to sit in the front row, one that now held a pen that signed contracts that changed the direction of the company. No one spoke, but between them was a story longer than any words could express. I think, if anyone has ever witnessed someone choosing silence over anger, they will understand that there is another kind of courage, the courage not to retaliate, to believe that justice does not require shouting. A silence fell in the restaurant, not out of fear, but out of shame. Everyone realized that they had just witnessed something rare, something kind, something real. Emily Ross stood at the counter, the tray in her hand tilted slightly. The coffee cup shook, sloshing to the brim, almost overflowing. She didn't dare move. A drop of coffee fell on her hand, burning, but she did not let go. Her eyes followed the two of them, and something inside her was breaking the thing people call conscience, when it is no longer asleep. Elijah patted his daughter's shoulder gently. "I'm fine," he said softly. His voice was still low and gentle, like the wind through the trees. "No. Dad, you're not okay," Sophia replied, shaking her head, her eyes glistening with tears. No one should be treated like this, especially Dad. Elijah smiled. He smiled like someone who knows that anger drags people down into the mud, while forgiveness makes others look at themselves. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but when they let go, it was as if the room had changed its place in silence. No one dared to look directly at Elijah anymore, but no one had the courage to look away either. Even the sound of breathing was clearly audible. Mrs. Margaret Hill, the silver-haired woman, put her hands on the table, tears welling in her eyes. She had taught her students that respect begins with seeing, and today she realized she had forgotten to see, too, in the other corner. Howard Jenkins put down his coffee cup and looked at his wife. "We were wrong," he said softly. She just nodded. As for Linda Price, the young girl holding the phone, gently turned it on. She didn't intend to take a photo, just to record a few seconds, not to post, but to remember. Because there are moments that people want to save, not to show off, but to remind themselves not to forget. Elijah and Sophia sat down. The father adjusted his glasses. The daughter opened the menu, flipping through the pages. "What would you like?" she asked. Same as before, probably a muffin and black coffee, as faithful as ever. Elijah Carter doesn't change easily. He smiled. They both laughed softly. The sound made the heavy room feel lighter, as if someone had opened a window to let in light. Emily stood there, unmoving. But when Sophia turned and called, "Waitress," she jumped. "Yes, yes." Her voice trembled. "An apple pie, please, and black coffee for my father, and some warm water." Emily nodded and retreated into the kitchen. Her hands were still shaking, but this time from regret, not fear. At the counter, Mark Duffy watched, his lips pressed together. He didn't speak, but his eyes said it all. We've gone too far. Outside, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating Elijah's silver hair and Sophia's calm face. I'd look at that scene if I had been there and realize sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to come with kindness and a hug. That embrace between father and son, between two generations that have endured different forms of injustice, was more than just affection. It was a response, an answer for Emily, for Mark, for the silent ones, and for those who were looking through the glass windows, seemingly outside of everything. Because in that moment, everyone was in this story. Their embrace made everyone reflect. No speeches were needed. No apologies were needed. Silence was no longer a weapon, but a sign of respect. Emily turned back and placed the tray on Elijah's table. She said softly, "I apologize, sir." Elijah looked at her, his eyes gentle, without anger, without resentment. "Thank you, girl." Those two words, "thank you," made Emily almost cry. Sophia looked at her father, then at Emily. No one said anything more, but they all knew this was how Elijah always taught, with character, not anger. I think if someone were to write about that morning, they would not remember the voices, but only the image of an elderly black man holding his daughter in the middle of a small breakfast shop. An image so warm that all the prejudices in that room melted away, slowly, like snow in the sun. The atmosphere in Harbor Light Cafe had not yet returned to normal after that hug. In fact, it probably would never be normal again. Elijah Carter sat silently, his hands clasped together on the table. He maintained a calm demeanor, as if the entire forgotten morning were no big deal. But Sophia, she didn't think so. She looked around, her gaze sweeping from table to table, from face to face. Everyone in the restaurant avoided her gaze. It was not the look of an angry person, but of someone accustomed to hiding their anger under a thin veneer of discipline. The light from the window illuminated her face. Her features were hard, her lips were pursed. On her wrist was a silver watch, the second hand ticking steadily, and it made each passing second feel very long. Sophia looked down at her father's table. It was empty. No coffee cup, no plate, no napkin. She set the menu down, gently, but the sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Everyone heard. She raised her head. "How long has my father been sitting here?" Her voice rang out, slow and clear, each word accented with a chilling restraint. No one answered. A few guests turned away. Sophia looked toward the counter. Emily Ross stood there, still holding the towel, her eyes averted. "You," Sophia said, not raising her voice. "I am asking." Emily started. The towel in her hand fell. She bent down to pick it up, trying to regain her composure. I was going to come right away. "Miss, it's just, don't lie," Sophia interrupted, her voice still low, but sharp as a knife. "I've been here for almost 10 minutes, and in all that time, I haven't seen anyone come near this table." No one in the bar dared to breathe loudly. Sophia took a step forward. The distance between her and Emily now only a few feet. "I ask again, why has my father been sitting here for almost an hour without being served?" Emily stepped back a little, her eyes red. I didn't mean to. You just ignored it," Sophia interrupted. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. No words were enough to justify what they had all seen. I think there are moments when you realize you're not just a witness, you are an accomplice, and this is that moment. Sophia took a deep breath. She looked around the bar, her voice now directed at everyone. "Can anyone here say otherwise? Did anyone see her serve my father?" No one spoke. A few eyes were cast down. One male customer tried to look out the window, pretending to be interested in a bird perched on an electric wire. Elijah gently touched his daughter's arm. "Come on, honey. Don't make a big deal out of it." She turned to him, her eyes softening for a moment. "Dad, I'm not making a big deal out of it. I just want to be fair. An apology shouldn't be that hard." Elijah was silent. He knew his daughter was speaking not just for him but for those who had been silent around them. Emily bit her lip. Tears began to flow. "I'm sorry." Her voice was so low it was barely audible. For what Sophia asked again, Emily was stunned. Because I didn't realize he was... No. Sophia interrupted coldly. "You don't need to know who he is to be kind. Just know he's a human being." The words fell to the floor, resounding and heavy. Margaret Hill's eyes filled with tears. Howard Jenkins bowed his head. Linda Price clenched the phone and turned it off, as if afraid she might accidentally record something too real. Elijah sighed, his voice as light as smoke. "Sophia, you don't need." But she turned back, her eyes still on Emily. "Dad, I need it, not to protect you, but to remind them that respect has no color, no class." She stood up straight and took a deep breath. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to get angry. Her calmness was already something that humbled everyone. Mark Duffy, the manager, stepped forward, forcing a smile. "Miss Carter, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. I'm sure it was just a small misunderstanding." Sophia turned around, her eyes cold as the morning lake. Misunderstanding, Mark stopped. A misunderstanding is when you order the wrong thing. Not when you leave an old man alone for almost an hour in a room full of people. No one responded. She looked at Emily, her voice low, almost sad. You know, sometimes cruelty comes not from doing something, but from doing nothing. Those words made Emily burst into tears. She nodded, wiping her tears and trembling. I know. I was wrong. Sophia looked at her for a few seconds, then lowered her voice. Good. Knowing wrong is the beginning of right. She turned back to her father, placing her hand on his shoulder. Dad, we can have breakfast now. Elijah looked at his daughter, his eyes a mixture of pride and sadness. He understood that she had just fought for him, and for many others she had never met. Sophia looked around the shop again. I hope next time someone needs help, you won't just look away. One sentence, so light, but it made the whole room breathe again. I think, in that moment, justice was restored not by a verdict, but by the truth spoken in the light. The air in the Harbor Light Cafe thickened like a thick fog. All movement stopped, spoons stopped in midair. The coffee machine stopped, and only the clock on the wall ticked softly, each heavy beat like a hand counting human errors. Sophia Carter straightened, her gaze sweeping the room. No more anger, no more need to raise her voice. Just clarity, the kind that comes when you know you're on the right side of things. She looked at Emily Ross, the blonde waitress, her face streaked with tears. Emily clutched the edge of her apron, her lip trembling. Sophia spoke slowly, her voice calm but as hard as steel. The man you just left alone for almost an hour. She paused for a moment. Is my father. The sound fell into space, shattering like glass. Everyone in the bar raised their heads at once. A few opened their mouths to say something, then stopped. Elijah Carter still sat there, his eyes kind, his gaze calm as if nothing had changed. But it was that calmness that made others feel small. Emily stood frozen. She took a step back, her face as white as a sheet. Your father, she stammered. Sophia nodded, her eyes never leaving her. And I, she said evenly, am the owner of this shop. Those words seemed to collapse the whole space. No one dared to breathe. Mark Duffy, the manager, swallowed, sweat beading on his forehead. The room shook, not with fear of power, but with shame. I remember, in that moment, it seemed like all the lights in the bar were focused on Sophia. Not physical light, but the light of justice, the kind that couldn't be masked by formality or just business. Elijah remained silent. He smiled softly, kindly, but his eyes were moist. Sophia walked slowly to the table, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder. Dad, I'm sorry I'm late. Elijah took his daughter's hand, his voice hoarse. No, honey, I'm glad you came when you did. The guests sat around in shock. Mrs. Margaret Hill, a middle-aged woman, gently placed her hand on her chest. She had seen Elijah sitting there, alone, ignored, and she had chosen to remain silent. Now that she knew he was the innkeeper's father, she felt her heart burn, not with fear, but with shame. And Howard Jenkins, the man who had once whispered. The waitress must have had her reasons. Now bowed his head, not daring to look at anyone. Sophia turned back. Her eyes stopped at Emily. She wasn't angry. She wasn't snapping. She just looked. But it was that look that made Emily feel like her defenses were being stripped away layer by layer. Emily tried to say, but her throat was dry. I don't know. I don't know who he is." "It doesn't matter who he is," Sophia interrupted, her voice low. "You just need to know he's human." Emily burst into tears. The sob was small, but in the silent room it sounded like thunder. Mark stepped closer, stammering. "Miss Carter, I had no idea. If I had known he was your father—" Sophia turned to look at him. "What else would you do?" Mark was silent. No more words. She pursed her lips and spoke slowly, each word falling like a hammer. "The scary thing is not that she abandoned my father. The scary thing is that everyone in this room saw it and chose to remain silent. Everyone bowed their heads. No one objected. I think there are some things that can shake a room without being shouted, and this is one of them." Sophia exhaled, her voice softening. "Miss Ross, I'm not firing you, but I want you to understand if you let fear or prejudice control you, you'll miss out on the opportunity to be a better person." Emily wiped her tears, nodded, unable to say a word. Elijah looked around, then said softly, "My daughter doesn't need anyone to be afraid. She just wants everyone to remember that kindness doesn't have to be a color." Another silence fell, this time not one of fear, but of awakening. Sophia nodded slightly, then turned back to her father. "You're right. Justice doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be seen. I sat there if I had been there, and I saw the eyes of the people around the table light up in a different way. Not the light of the yellow ceiling lights, but the light of a new awareness, the kind that people only get when they're forced to look at themselves." Mark bowed his head and said in a low voice, "Miss Carter, we are sorry." Sophia nodded slightly. "Keep that apology, but put it into action." She turned back and whispered to her father, "Let's go, Dad." Elijah stood up, slowly taking his cane. Everyone in the tavern moved aside, making way. No one was told to, but they stood, a silent gesture of respect. As father and son stepped out the door, the morning light streamed in, illuminating their faces. Elijah turned his head and smiled slightly at everyone. No one dared to say anything, but that smile was a word of forgiveness. The door closed, the little bell rang again. It sounded different, no longer a call to a visitor, but a wake-up call for the entire room. I think sometimes justice comes not with anger, but with a truth so bright that everyone bows their heads. No one in the bar said another word. The doorbell that had rung as Elijah and Sophia left seemed to linger in the air, lingering and quiet like the echo of a song that had just ended, and no one dared to applaud. Emily Ross was still standing there, in the middle of the bright wooden floor, her apron heavy with a burden she couldn't shake off. She bowed her head, her hands clasped together, her nails leaving marks on her skin. Her voice trembled, thin as a thread. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I will do better. No more tears, just ragged breathing." Sophia stood still. She was no longer as cold as before, but her eyes still held the sternness of someone who had suffered too much to believe in easy apologies. She spoke slowly, enunciating each word. "You will have the chance to prove it." Emily looked up, her eyes wet with surprise. Sophia continued, her voice low. "But if this happens again, you have no place here. The statement isn't threatening. It's just a line, a thin line, but enough to let others know where you stand." Mark Duffy, the manager, bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "Miss Carter, thank you for the opportunity. I guarantee things will change here." Sophia looked at him, just nodded slightly. "I hope you keep your word." Mrs. Margaret Hill, the middle-aged woman sitting in the corner, quietly placed the tip on the table and stood up. As she passed Emily, she stopped and said softly, her voice trembling, "Girl, I was wrong too. I saw, and I did nothing." Emily looked up, tears welling up again. Two women, one young, one older, stood face to face, both carrying the same shame, different in timing, but similar in root. "I wouldn't dare," Emily replied. "For fear of losing my job." Mrs. Hill nodded. "I, for one, am afraid of trouble, but we both have more to lose than that." The sentence passed as lightly as a breath, but lingered in the room for a long time. A few other guests also stood up. None spoke loudly, none defended themselves. I remember the morning light that was streaming in through the glass windows, illuminating their faces, faces that had just been illuminated by the truth. Sophia turned to Mark. "You need to retrain your staff, not just in the technical aspects, but in how to look at people." "Yes, I understand," Mark said softly, almost in a whisper. Sophia took a deep breath. She wasn't gloating or venting. She was just tired, because sometimes facing the truth was more tiring than being angry. Elijah, still standing next to his daughter, said softly, "Daughter, let's go." "I've said enough." Sophia turned, her eyes softening. "Yes, Dad." She put her hand on his arm and guided him toward the door. Their steps were slow, but each step seemed to weigh as much as the consciences of the rest of the people in the tavern. As the door closed, the bell rang again. The sound was soft, but this time it was different. It was no longer a greeting, but the sigh of a place that had just witnessed the truth. Emily stood there, her hands clutching the edge of her apron. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just staring out through the frosted glass at the fading light around them. "I will do better," she whispered again, as if to herself. Mark stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Nobody's perfect, Emily, but don't forget this feeling. It will help you remember why you need to be kind." She nodded, saying nothing. In another corner, Mrs. Hill was still standing there, watching, her eyes filled with tears. Howard Jenkins, the man who had sat beside her, put his hand gently on her shoulder and said in a low voice, "We have been silent for too long. Margaret, maybe it is time to say the right thing, even if it is just a small thing." She turned, smiling slightly. "That's right. Justice doesn't need shouting." Howard, outside. Sunlight streamed down onto the quiet street. A light breeze blew, carrying with it the lingering scent of apple pie. In the tavern, the silence returned, but not the same as before. It was no longer the silence of indifference, but the silence of awareness, of people who had just learned a lesson without anyone telling them. I think if anyone had walked into Harbor Light Cafe that morning, they would have seen just an ordinary cafe, a few pensive customers, a waitress wiping tables in silence. But if they looked closely, they would have seen something else in each person's eyes. There was a small change, as light as the wind, but real. Sometimes shame is the starting point of wisdom, and sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be said, just giving someone a chance to start over. The atmosphere in Harbor Light Cafe was still heavy, not the heavy feeling of anger or fear, but the feeling one gets when one sees oneself in the mirror of truth, naked and unable to look away. Sophia Carter stood in the middle of the room. She was no longer the cold authority figure, nor the angry daughter on behalf of her father. She was just a human being speaking to others equally, frankly and truly. "Listen to me," she began, her voice low and firm. All eyes turned to her. Mark Duffy stopped wiping the counter. Emily Ross remained standing, her head bowed, her hands clutching her apron. Mrs. Margaret Hill and Mr. Howard Jenkins were silent, their faces tense, as if every word they were about to say would cut into the silence they had been hiding behind all morning. Silence in the face of injustice. Sophia said slowly, "Is complicity. No one breathes." She scanned the room. "I'm not talking about just this waitress. I'm talking about all of us, about how we choose to keep our heads down, to look away, just so we don't have to see ourselves in our mistakes." Her voice was not high, but it carried through the air like wind coming through cracks in a door. "Next time," she continued, "don't just look. Stand up." No one applauded, but a few nodded. An old man sitting near the window lowered his glasses and nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. Mrs. Hill wiped away her tears. Howard Jenkins looked out, where the morning light washed away the dust. Sophia took a deep breath. She said nothing more, because she knew what needed to be said had been said, and sometimes silence after the truth was the way to let it sink in. Elijah Carter was still standing beside her. He looked at his daughter, a gentle smile, a smile that was a mixture of pride and weariness. "You're right," he said softly, "but you didn't need anyone to stand up for you. You did it yourself." Sophia looked at him, her eyes softening. "No, Dad," she said. "They need to know they can do it too. Not for me, for themselves." He nodded, as if understanding something deeper than words. Inside the shop, sunlight poured in, reflecting off the mirrors, sparkling. The heavy atmosphere seemed to soften. Emily stepped forward, her voice low. "Thank you. Ms. Carter, I will never forget today." Sophia looked at her, not smiling, but her voice was softer. "Good, don't forget. But more importantly, take action. Every day is an opportunity to do the right thing." Mark Duffy, the manager, stepped forward and said slowly, "I think, from today, this place will be different. I will be different." Sophia looked at him and nodded slightly. "Don't change for me. Change for yourself." There was another silence, but it was no longer the silence of shame. It was the silence of people who were thinking, who were really listening. If I were the one sitting in the corner of the shop that day, would probably have just watched them, and, in my mind, a simple question echoed. How many times in my life have I also kept silent about wrongdoing? Just because it did not affect me, Sophia turned around, looking around one last time. "Gentlemen," she said slowly, "if I hadn't come in this morning, it might have been just another day, but normal isn't always right." Elijah touched her shoulder lightly, as if to say that was enough, but she continued, her voice low, almost a whisper. "A just world doesn't begin with laws. It begins with how people treat each other when no one is looking." The words fell to the wooden floor, lightly but deeply. Everyone stood still. A young customer placed a tip on the table without saying a word. Another stranger stepped forward to help Emily clear the table. Small, insignificant acts, but that was how the guilt began to wash away. Elijah nodded slightly, then smiled gently. "Let's go home now, daughter." Sophia turned, smiling. "Yes, Dad." They stepped outside together. The light from the windows poured in, casting a long, warm beam of sunlight on the floor. The doorbell rang, the sound no longer sad, but a greeting of a new morning. The door closed. For a moment, everyone in the restaurant stood still. Then each person sat down, quietly, thoughtfully. No one talked, no one joked, but everyone knew, from that day on, no one would walk into Harbor Light Cafe without thinking one thing. Kindness, no matter how small, can mean the difference between humiliation and dignity. I think justice sometimes doesn't come from courts. It doesn't come from police. It doesn't come from lawyers. It comes from small rooms where people learn to see each other as human beings again. Elijah Carter and Sophia Carter walked out of Harbor Light Cafe. The door closed behind them, leaving behind a soft ringing of the bell, a small but long and clear sound, like the last breath of a turbulent morning. Outside, the sun was already up. The morning light wasn't too harsh, just enough to brighten everything. The old roof tiles, the wooden sign hanging on the front door, and the thin layer of mist still lingering on the road. Sophia led her father slowly along the red brick path. Their shadows stretched out, then merged on the pavement, as if time had stopped for them to walk in silence. Elijah bent slightly, one hand holding his cane, the other gently grasping his daughter's wrist. The gesture, simple yet warm, not only a support from young to old, but also a continuation of 2 generations of steadfastness and kindness. He turned to look at Sophia, a gentle smile appearing in his time-worn eyes. "My daughter is strong," he said, his voice low and proud. Sophia smiled slightly. It was soft as a breath, but genuine. "I learned that from you," she replied. The two of them stopped at the sidewalk. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the lingering scent of coffee in the air. In that moment, the world seemed to shrink, leaving only 2 people, one who had endured in silence, the other who chose to speak up for justice. Inside the cafe, through the glass, people could still see out. Emily Ross was standing there, her eyes on the father and son. She didn't dare step out, just put her hand on her chest, where her heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from another emotion, gratitude and regret. Mrs. Margaret Hill sat back at her old desk, slowly turning the ring on her finger, muttering something a small prayer. Perhaps Mark Duffy, the manager, stood still, his eyes following Sophia until she and her father disappeared down the street. I think there are mornings when you forget you live in a small town, because it's bigger than that. It's become a mirror of how people choose to deal with wrongs. Elijah stopped at a bench by the side of the road. He sat down gently, breathing slowly, his eyes looking out into the distance at the shady trees. Sophia sat beside him, silent. "Are you sad, Dad?" she asked in a small voice. He smiled. "No, my dear, just tired. Tired of not having learned that kindness is not a privilege." Sophia nodded slightly. "But today, at least some people have started studying." Elijah tilted his head, looking at her, and I taught them by not yelling at anyone. They smiled together, a small, warm, sad smile. Across the street, a white girl of about 6 was walking a small dog. She stopped, smiled at Elijah, and waved. Elijah nodded in response, his eyes shining no trace of hurt in them, just a simple belief that maybe things would get better. Sophia stood up and held out her hand to her father. "Dad, let's go home. I think I need some rest, and maybe you do too." Elijah leaned on his cane and stood slowly. Before leaving, he turned to look back at the cafe where, hours earlier, he had sat quietly in apathy. The glass windows now reflected light, illuminating the cafe, he said softly, as if talking to himself. Forgiveness is also a form of justice. My child. Sophia took his hand and nodded. Yes, and I think. You just taught me that. They walked together, the sun stretching out before them. The light danced on the pavement, reflecting off Elijah's worn shoes and Sophia's dress. Each step they took felt slow, gentle, but sure, as if they were entering another world, a world where people didn't need to shout to be respected, where power didn't need to be heard. I, the witness, still remember that image forever. Two figures walking in the light, in the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, in the warmth of a peaceful morning. No music, no applause, just silence. But it was the kind of silence that people felt safe to hear. Because sometimes, justice doesn't need to be won. It just needs to be seen, felt, and lived. And that morning, in a small cafe in a seaside town, Harbor Light Cafe taught everyone one thing. Respect, dignity, and justice don't come from position. They come from how we treat others when no one is watching. The story ended with light. Carter and his father disappeared at the end of the street, where the sunlight reflected like a thin golden strip stretching endlessly. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of coffee, mingling with the sounds of the small street. If someone walked into the shop at this time, they would see just an ordinary place. But if they stayed long enough, they might feel something else, like the warmth left after justice had passed, quiet and real enough to make people want to believe that people can still improve day by day. Thank you, who took the time to stay with us until the end of today's story. Perhaps you also feel that sometimes what changes the world is not great things, but an understanding look, a kind action, or simply choosing the right silence. The story of Harbor Light Cafe, of Elijah and Sophia Carter, is not just about discrimination or justice, but a reminder that kindness and respect can still sprout even in the smallest of places. If you believe that these values need to be spread, that stories like this deserve to be heard, then please click like, share this video with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys, where we together find faith in humanity, in kindness, and in quiet but enduring justice, a justice that starts from our own hearts. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. See you in the next story, where we will once again witness people choosing the light over the darkness.